They say you should never fall in love with your boss. They say it like it's a rule, like gravity, like something that simply cannot be broken without consequences, without the whole world tilting sideways, without the floor disappearing beneath your feet, without everything you thought you knew about yourself dissolving like sugar in warm water. They say never fall for your boss. I said that too once. I believed it actually. And then I met Daniel Reeves. See, this isn't just a love story. This is the story of a man who built walls so high not even sunlight got through. A man who buried himself in spreadsheets and quarterly reports because feelings, real feelings, were far too dangerous. That man was me. And for 3 years I kept every single emotion locked behind a professional smile, a starched collar, and a perfectly rehearsed "yes, sir." But one night, one single, ordinary Tuesday night in November, everything changed. And I mean asterisk everything. So if you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to love, if you've ever chosen silence over the risk of being seen, if you've ever stood at the edge of something terrifying and beautiful at the same time and had to decide whether to jump, then this story is for you. My name is Eli Carter, and this is the story of how the most guarded man in the world broke me open, and how, in breaking me, he finally broke himself free. I remember the first time I saw Daniel Reeves. It was a Monday morning in September, 3 years ago, and I was 26 years old, freshly hired as a junior communications associate at Meridian Creative Group, one of the most prestigious branding firms in Chicago. I landed the job after 6 brutal rounds of interviews, 2 portfolio reviews, and one genuinely humiliating presentation where I dropped my laptop and accidentally shown the panel a photo of my cat instead of a campaign mock-up. And yet somehow I'd gotten the call, I'd gotten the job. I'd worn my best blazer that first day, navy blue, slightly too tight across the shoulders because I'd bought it during a hopeful period of my life when I thought I was going to start working out. I had my leather portfolio under my arm, my resume printed on expensive paper, and enough anxiety humming through my chest to power a small city. The Meridian offices occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise, floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed concrete and dark wood, and those big pendant lights that cost more than my monthly rent. It looked like a magazine spread, like a place where important things happen to important people. I didn't feel important, I felt like a fraud in a too-tight blazer. And then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the open floor plan near the glass-walled conference room they called the fishbowl. He was on the phone, one hand in his pocket, the other pressed flat against the glass as he stared out at the city. Tall, dark hair, the kind that curled slightly at the back of the neck as if it had its own ideas about where to go. He was wearing charcoal gray trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and even from across a crowded office floor you could feel the stillness around him, like weather before a storm, like the held breath before music begins. "That's the creative director," said a voice beside me. I turned. A woman was smiling at me, bright eyes, natural curls, a coffee mug that read "I survived another meeting that could have been an email. Daniel Reeves, don't let him intimidate you." She stuck out her hand. "I'm Priya, your desk neighbor as of today." "Eli," I said, shaking it, "should he intimidate me?" Priya tilted her head toward the glass office at the back. "He's the best in the business. Literally, like industry award-winning clients flying from Tokyo best. He's also," she paused, searching for the right word, "not exactly warm, but he's fair and brilliant, and if he gives you a chance and he doesn't give many, you take it with both hands." I looked back at Daniel. He'd ended his call and was now standing at a drafting table, studying something with the focused intensity of a man who'd forgotten the rest of the world existed. I filed that image away somewhere in my memory. I didn't know why. I didn't think anything of it. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. My first week was a blur of onboarding materials, brand guidelines, and trying to remember where the good coffee machine was. The office had two, one near the kitchen that made perfectly decent drip coffee, and one hidden in the back corner by the supply closet that ground fresh beans and produced something that tasted like it had been brewed in heaven. Daniel, I quickly learned, was the only person who used the good one. Not because he'd forbidden others, he hadn't. It was just that people seemed instinctively reluctant to occupy the same small space as him. There was an invisible radius around Daniel Reeves, a kind of personal gravitational field, and most people, even senior staff, seemed to orbit at a careful distance. Not me, not on day 4. Day 4, I was running on 3 hours of sleep. I had a presentation due by noon, and I needed coffee the way a drowning man needs air. I didn't even think about who might be standing there. I just made a beeline for the good machine, rounded the corner, and almost walked directly into Daniel Reeves's chest. He caught my arm, one quick, reflexive movement to stop me from spilling the folder I was carrying. We were close enough that I could smell his cologne, something dark and quiet, cedar and something else I couldn't name. Sorry, I managed. I didn't. The dark roast or the medium, he asked. I blinked, sorry. He gestured at the machine, which had 2 hopper options. The dark roast is stronger. If you're running on limited sleep, you probably want the dark. I stared at him for a moment. His eyes were gray-green, I noticed. The kind that looked different depending on the light. Right now, under the fluorescence, they were almost silver. Dark roast, I said, please. He reached past me, adjusted a setting on the machine, pressed 2 buttons, the grinder word. You're the new communications associate, he said, not a question. Eli Carter, yes, sir. I wasn't sure why I added the sir, it just seemed to belong there. I read your onboarding brief, he said. Your campaign concept for the Atlas footwear account, the one you included as a writing sample, was good. The consumer narrative was better than what my team produced last quarter. He handed me a cup of coffee and walked away. That was it. No follow-up, no smile, just a single devastating piece of praise delivered as plainly as a weather report, and then he was gone. I stood there in the corner by the supply closet, holding my coffee, feeling something strange and warm settle in my chest. I didn't have a word for it then. I should have known better than to let it stay. Music, gentle, slightly wistful, a melody that feels like possibility. Over the following months, I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. Not because anyone demanded it, but because I wanted to be good. I wanted to be the kind of person who deserved to be in that building, at that desk, doing work that mattered. Priya became my closest friend at the office, brilliant, funny, the kind of person who could diffuse a tense client meeting with a single perfectly timed joke. She took me under her wing in every way she could. But it was Daniel's feedback I lived for. Not because he gave it often, he rarely did. He wasn't the kind of creative director who hovered over desks or handed out praise like candy. He was precise and economical with his words. When he said something was good, it was better than a standing ovation from anyone else. When he said something needed work, it stung, but it was always right. I started noticing things, small things. The way he took his coffee, dark roast, no sugar, always in the same ceramic mug, never a paper cup. The way he stayed late every Tuesday and Thursday, long after the office emptied out, and how the light in the fishbowl would still be on when I left at 8 or 9. The way he moved through the office, not briskly but deliberately, like each step was considered. The way he listened in meetings, completely still, eyes focused, and then spoke once, with such clarity that the whole room seemed to reorganize itself around what he'd said. He was magnetic. And I told myself, simply paying close professional attention to someone I admired. I told myself that for about 7 months. Then came the Harlow account. The Harlow account was the biggest pitch Meridian had taken on in 3 years. Harlow & Sons was a century-old furniture company trying to rebrand for a new generation. They wanted to feel timeless and modern at the same time, which is the creative equivalent of being asked to run backwards at full speed while looking graceful. Daniel was leading the pitch team personally, which meant when he pulled me into his office on a gray Wednesday morning and told me he wanted me on the account, I nearly knocked my chair over standing up. The rest of the team will handle visual identity and campaign architecture, he said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. I want you on consumer narrative, the story of the brand, why a family in 2024 chooses a piece of furniture that's been made the same way since 1923. That's the emotional center of this pitch. Can you do that? Yes, I said immediately. He looked up then, that silver-gray gaze. Don't say yes because you think it's what I want to hear. Say yes because you know you can deliver. Something steadied inside me. Yes, I said again, I can deliver it. For a moment the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but something. Good, you have 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were the most intense of my professional life, and also, though I wouldn't admit it even to myself, some of the most alive I'd ever felt. The team met every morning at 9 in the fishbowl. There were 6 of us: me, Priya on visual strategy, a designer named Marcus, an art director named Jess, a data analyst named Tamaz, and Daniel at the head of the table. He ran those meetings like a conductor, giving each person space to contribute, but shaping the whole thing with a precision that made you feel like even the silences were intentional. I stayed late nearly every night. Sometimes Daniel would still be there at the drafting table or the big screen, moving things around, testing ideas against each other. We didn't talk much on those nights, but there was something comfortable in the parallel quiet of it, two people working in the same space, separately but together. One night about 2 weeks in, I was stuck. I had pages of research, interview transcripts from Harlow customers, brand history documents, but I couldn't find the thread. I couldn't find the emotional core of the story, and without it, everything I'd written felt flat and hollow. I was sitting at my desk at 9:30, staring at a blank document with a cursor that blinked with what felt like judgment, when I heard footsteps stop beside me. "You're still here," Daniel said. "So are you," I said before I could think better of it. He looked mildly surprised, not offended, just caught off guard, like he wasn't used to being answered in kind. "Fair," he said. He looked at my screen. "What's wrong with it?" "I can't find the story," I said. "I know all the facts, I know why the brand matters historically, I know the craftsmanship argument, but I can't find the reason someone feels asterisk something when they sit in a Harlow chair. I can't find the—" I gestured uselessly at the air. "The soul of it," Daniel said quietly. "Yes, exactly." He was quiet for a moment. Then, to my utter surprise, he pulled up the chair from the empty desk beside mine and sat down. Not in his office, not across a conference table. Right next to me, close enough that I could see the faint lines of tiredness around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a tension that never quite released. "My grandfather had a Harlow table," he said. I turned to look at him. "Dining table, oak. He bought it in 1971 secondhand for his first apartment in Detroit." He was looking at my screen, not at me, but his voice had shifted to something softer and further away. "He used it his whole life. I ate breakfast at that table every Saturday morning until I was 14 and he died. And when my grandmother passed 12 years later, we argued, my father and his brother, we genuinely argued about who got the table, not the house. Not the savings, the table." He was quiet again. "Because the table was Saturday mornings," I said softly. "The table was him." Daniel turned and looked at me. Something passed across his face, something unguarded and sudden, like a door blown open by wind. Then it closed again, but I'd seen it. "That's your story," he said simply. "That's the soul of it." He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked back toward his office. But just before he turned the corner, he paused. "Eli." "Yes." "The story you tell, make sure it's true. The best brand narratives aren't crafted, they're discovered." And then he was gone. I wrote for 3 hours straight that night. I wrote the best thing I'd ever written. And somewhere in those 3 hours, somewhere between the words and the quiet office and the memory of a door blown briefly open in Daniel Reeves's guarded face, I admitted to myself what I'd been refusing to admit for 7 months. I was in love with my boss. God help me, I was in love with my boss. Music, a soft ache, like something beautiful and impossible. The pitch was on a Friday. We went into that conference room like a unit, like people who had built something together and knew it. Daniel presented the strategy. Jess and Marcus unveiled the visual work. Tamaz walked through the data. Priya handled the room with her effortless charm, and then Daniel handed it to me. I stood up in front of the Harlow executives, 3 generations of the same family, seated in a row like a living timeline, and I told them about my boss's grandfather's table. I didn't use Daniel's story by name, of course. I universalized it. I turned it into every family's story. The table that held Sunday dinners and arguments and first report cards and last meals before someone left for college. The chair someone sat in every morning until the cushion remembered their shape. The furniture that outlived the person who chose it and became, in outliving them, a kind of love letter. When I finished, the room was silent. Then the eldest Harlow, 70-something, white-haired, the kind of stillness that comes from a long life, pressed his lips together and said, "Young man, that's exactly right. That's exactly what we've been trying to say for 100 years and never found the words for." We got the account. The celebration that evening was at a bar 2 blocks from the office. The team, loud and relieved and happy, spilling out of a corner booth with drinks and laughter. I was genuinely happy for the first time in months. The kind of happiness that sits light and real in your chest without the usual anxiety underneath. Daniel was there, which surprised me. He usually didn't come to these things, or that was the impression I'd gotten. But there he was, at the edge of the booth with a whiskey, looking almost relaxed. Priya appeared at my elbow. "He came," she whispered. "He literally never comes to these. This is unprecedented." "Maybe he wanted to celebrate," I said. She gave me a look, a very specific, knowing look, and said, maybe." I didn't ask what she meant. At some point in the evening, the group splintered, some people hitting the dance floor, others heading home to partners and children and morning alarm clocks. I found myself at the bar, ordering water because I was starting to get that particular kind of tired that too much emotion and adrenaline produces. And Daniel materialized beside me, setting down his empty glass. "Good work today," he said. "Good story," I said. "Thank you for giving it to me." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't give you the story, you found it. You pointed me toward it." He looked at me, that long, measuring look he sometimes used in meetings, as if he were reading something printed very small. "Why do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Redirect credit. Every time someone acknowledges your work, you find a way to make it about someone else." I was surprised enough to be honest. "I don't know," I said. "Habit maybe." "Break it," he said. "You're too good at what you do to keep apologizing for it." Then his phone rang. He glanced at it and something in his expression shifted, complicated, private. "I have to take this," he said. "Congratulations, Eli, you earned it." He answered the call and walked out toward the street, and I watched him go, and the warmth in my chest was so tangled up with ache by then that I couldn't have told you where one ended and the other began. Let me tell you something about Daniel Reeves that I had to piece together over 2 years of watching and listening and reading between silences. He was private the way a house is private when all the curtains are drawn. You could see the shape of it from the street, the lights on inside, the evidence of someone living there, but the inside was sealed away and no one was invited in. What I knew of him was mostly what the office knew. He'd founded Meridian Creative Group at 31 after spending his 20s at two bigger firms. He'd built it from 6 people to 60. He was 40 now, 9 years older than me. He didn't date, or if he did, no one knew about it. He had no social media presence. He left every Friday evening with a leather overnight bag and no one knew where he went and no one asked. He was kind, not warm but kind. When Tamaz's father was ill and Tamaz needed 3 weeks of leave, Daniel gave it without question. When Jess came back from maternity leave and needed a modified schedule, it was arranged before she even asked. When a junior designer made a catastrophic error on a client deliverable, Daniel absorbed the consequences and never once raised his voice or his blame. He was private and fair and brilliant and present in the room in a way that made you feel, when his attention was on you, like you were the only person in the building. I was in love with him, and I decided with the clean finality of someone choosing to live with a diagnosis that I would never do anything about it. I had reasons, good ones. He was my boss. The power imbalance alone made the very idea something to be quietly suffocated. I needed this job. I needed the career I was building here. I needed the professional relationship more than I could afford to risk it on feelings that were almost certainly, one-sided. And besides, he had walls, the kind that told you they'd been built for reasons, the kind you don't knock on because you understand instinctively that whoever built them paid for them in something real. So I did what I was good at. I worked. I let the feelings exist quietly, the way you learn to coexist with a noise in the background that you can't turn off. You just stop expecting silence. For almost 2 years, that was enough. And then November came. Music, something shifts here, colder, more tense. November started badly and got worse. My mother called on the 5th to tell me that my father had been hospitalized, a cardiac event, they were calling it, which is medical language for something that sounds manageable until you're standing in a hospital car park at 10 in the evening, watching rain hit asphalt and feeling the whole architecture of your certainty begin to crack. My father recovered. He was home within a week on medication and a new diet, grumbling about the food with the energy of someone planning to outlive everyone who worried about him. But something had shifted inside me during those days, something that couldn't be shifted back. You spend enough time sitting in hospital waiting rooms and something happens to your tolerance for pretending. I came back to the office after 4 days of family leave and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like the walls I'd built around my feelings weren't protection anymore. They were just weight. I threw myself back into work. That was the only language I trusted. The night was a Tuesday, the 14th of November. There was a storm coming. The city had been warning about it for days, and by 7 in the evening the wind was audible even through the high-rise windows, a low, persistent pressure against the glass. Most of the office had cleared out early, the weather serving as universal permission to leave. By 7:30 the floor was empty except for the hum of the ventilation system. And me. And Daniel. I was working on a brand identity document for a new account, not urgent, just what I did when I needed to feel useful, when I needed the rhythm of work to quiet the noise inside me. My father's face in a hospital bed, the smell of disinfectant, my mother's voice on the phone, controlled and steady right up until it wasn't, all of it sitting underneath every sentence I tried to write. I was staring at the screen without seeing it when I heard footsteps, and Daniel appeared at my desk with 2 cups of coffee from the good machine. He set one in front of me without saying anything. I looked up. "You've been staring at the same paragraph for 14 minutes, he said. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked out the window at the approaching storm. "Have you been watching me?" The words came out before I could stop them. He was quiet for a moment. "I happened to notice," he said, which was not quite a denial. He sat on the edge of the desk across from mine, not the chair, the actual desk, which was so unlike him that I registered it somewhere in the back of my mind as significant. He held his coffee in both hands and looked out at the darkening sky. "How is your father?" he asked. I hadn't told him. I'd told HR for the leave form, but I hadn't told him. "He's okay," I said. "He's home, he'll be." My voice did something strange, a small catch I hadn't expected. "He'll be fine." Daniel nodded slowly. "Good." We were quiet. The storm was pressing closer. I could hear it now, the distant sound of it, like something large breathing. "Can I ask you something?" I said. I don't know where it came from. Tiredness, maybe, or the particular permission that crisis gives you, the weeks after a near loss, when you stop having the patience for every single thing you're pretending not to feel. "Yes," Daniel said. "The story about your grandfather's table, you've never told it to anyone else here, have you? You've never told anyone at this office something personal about yourself." He turned and looked at me, that silver-gray gaze in the dim evening light. "No," he said, "I haven't." "Why did you tell me?" The silence that followed was long enough that I thought he might not answer, or stand up and walk away, or simply pretend I hadn't asked. But he stayed. "I don't know," he said at last. And the honesty in it, the plain, unguarded honesty, was so unlike anything I'd expected that I felt it in my sternum like a note struck on a piano. "I don't know," he said again, quieter. "I've thought about it." Music very quiet now, just piano, slow and careful. The storm arrived. Not with drama, or rather, not with drama at first. Just the rain, sudden and complete, hammering the windows from one direction and then another as the wind shifted. The city below disappeared into gray-white static. We were suspended up here, 32 floors above the world, in a glass room with rain on all sides. I don't know who moved first. I'm not sure either of us moved at all. It was more like the room contracted slightly, the storm pressing us toward its center, and we were simply both there. "My father had a heart attack last April," Daniel said. I went very still. "He was 68, he survived, he's a beat, he's fine now, but I was in Tokyo when it happened. I was sitting in a meeting about a packaging redesign for a luxury goods company, and my phone was on silent, and by the time I saw the messages he was already out of surgery." He looked down at his coffee. I hadn't spoken to him in 4 months. We'd argued something stupid, the kind of thing that seems important at the time, and then he stopped. I sat in an airport hotel room in Tokyo waiting for a flight, and I thought, if he had died, the last thing between us would have been an argument about money. The rain against the windows, the low moan of wind. "He didn't die," I said softly. "No, he didn't die," he looked up. "But I've thought about it since then. How much energy I put into being careful, professional, contained, how much I've used this office, this work," as he paused, hunting for the word. "A wall," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me for a long time. "Yes," he said, "a wall." I should have said something neutral, something gentle and professional and appropriately boundaried. I should have let the moment pass, should have picked up my coffee and changed the subject and pulled the evening back from wherever it was heading. Instead I said, "What are you keeping out?" And Daniel Reeves, the most private, most guarded, most behind-the-glass man I had ever known, looked at me in the rain-dark evening with an expression that I can only describe as the look of a man deciding, finally, to stop running. He didn't answer right away. He stood up from the desk edge and walked to the window, pressing one hand against the glass the same way I'd seen him on my very first day, looking out at the city. Except now the city was gone, swallowed by the storm, and he was looking at nothing but rain. "I was engaged," he said, 7 years ago. I didn't know that, no one knew that. His name was Adam, he is an architect. We were together for 4 years, we were good together, I think we were good together. A pause. He said we weren't, he said that being with me was like, his mouth tightened briefly, like loving a house where all the lights are on but no one answers the door. I remembered Priya's description. Not exactly warm. I thought about what it must have cost someone to love Daniel and feel locked outside of him. I thought about what it must have cost Daniel to hear it. He wasn't wrong, Daniel continued, and the simplicity of his self-awareness was startling. I knew it when he said it, I knew he was right, I just also didn't know how to be different. He turned from the window. So after Adam, I decided it was easier not to try, to keep the door closed from the inside and invest everything that I might have given to a person into. He gestured at the office around them. This. And has it been easier? I asked. Another long pause. No, he said, it's been controllable, which is not the same thing. I stood up. I didn't plan to. My body simply moved and I was standing in the middle of the office floor and Daniel was standing at the window and there were perhaps 4 feet between us and the rain was making the world outside completely private, as if the storm had drawn a curtain around us. I'm going to tell you something, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. And then I'm going to go home because I don't want to make this into something that makes your life difficult or changes what we've built here professionally. I just need to say it once because I am so tired of the weight of not saying it. He looked at me without moving. I am in love with you, I said. I have been for almost 2 years. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever worked with and probably the most extraordinary person I have met and my voice finally wavered just slightly. I see you, Daniel, not the creative director, not the industry reputation. I see the man who tells a story about his grandfather's table and leaves the room before anyone can see what it cost him. I see the man who stays late every Tuesday and Thursday because this building is easier than wherever he goes on weekends. I see the man who gives everyone around him exactly what they need and keeps absolutely nothing for himself. I stopped breathed. That's all, I said. I just needed to say it. I don't expect anything. I know this is. Eli. His voice was very quiet, very still. Stop apologizing, he said. Music, a held breath, the whole world pausing. He crossed the 4 feet between us. Not quickly, not dramatically. He crossed the distance between us the same way he did everything, deliberately, like a man who has made a decision and intends to follow it all the way to the end. And he stopped close enough that I could see the exact color of his eyes, which in this light were neither silver nor green but some impossible mixture of both. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I have spent 7 years learning how not to do this. I have been very committed to not doing this. I know, I said. But I have thought about you, he said, and the words were slow like something being excavated, in ways that have nothing to do with work for longer than I want to admit. And I have, his jaw tightened slightly, the effort of honesty against habit. I have made up a dozen reasons why it would be wrong. The professional relationship, the power dynamic, the fact that I don't, he stopped. The fact that I don't know how to let someone close without eventually making them feel like what Adam described. The house where no one answers the door, I said softly. Yes. Daniel, I said his name, his first name, which I had never used before, not once in 2 years, always Sir Asterisk, always the careful professional distance. I'm not standing outside, I'm already here. I've been here for 2 years, watching you from a desk 30 feet away, knowing every single one of your professional habits and exactly nothing of what you actually feel, and still, my voice broke gently, still choosing to be in this building every single day because even that much of you was worth it. Something in his face came apart, quietly like ice in warm water. He raised one hand and touched my jaw, just his fingertips, barely, the most tentative, careful touch I'd ever felt, as if he were testing the temperature of something he'd thought untouchable for years. I don't want to hurt you, he said. I know. I probably will, not because I want to, but because. Daniel, I turned my face very slightly into his hand. I know, I'm here anyway. And he kissed me. Music, warm now, open, full, like something that's been held back finally released. It was nothing like I'd imagined it. I'd imagined it dramatic. I'm not ashamed to admit it, I'd imagined it 100 times in the quiet of late-night train rides home and early morning commutes and every moment between in which I'd very firmly told myself not to imagine it. In my imagination it was cinematic, sweeping, the kind of kiss that comes with a soundtrack. The actual kiss was quieter than that, it was careful. It was Daniel Reeves finally choosing to answer the door and finding that he remembered how. We pulled apart and looked at each other in the rain-gray light and I started laughing. Not from nervousness, or not only from nervousness, but from the sheer, wild relief of it. 2 years of weight lifting. Daniel looked startled and I will carry this image for the rest of my life, Daniel Reeves smiled. A real smile, not the near miss of a smile I'd catalogued over 2 years. An actual, complete, devastating smile, the kind that rearranged his whole face into something younger and more open and entirely wholly beautiful. What's funny, he said, but he was smiling when he said it. Nothing, I said, everything. I don't know. I shook my head. You should smile more, it's profoundly unfair that you don't. He laughed then, a short, surprised sound like a man who'd forgotten he could. I'll take it under advisement. We sat down together on the big sectional in the open lounge area, the one used for informal client meetings, angled toward the windows, and we talked. For 3 hours, while the storm passed and the rain slowed and the city gradually reappeared below us, we talked. He told me about Adam, about the engagement and the ending and the 4 months of silence between, about his parents in Cleveland and his father's recovery and the conversations he'd had to learn to have again, about what it had cost him all those years to keep the door locked, what he'd gained and what he'd lost, and how he'd stopped being sure the trade had been worth it. I told him about my father's hospitalization, about my family, my little sister who still called me every Sunday and my mother who sent voice memos instead of texts because she'd never learned to type quickly enough, and my father, who grumbled about his medication but called me every Wednesday to talk about football even though neither of us much cared about football. It was just the excuse, just the reason to call. I told him about the loneliness of the past 2 years. Not misery, not that, but the particular loneliness of loving someone at a careful, professional distance, of editing every thought before it became a word, of building a brilliant working relationship on a foundation that was both true and not quite complete. He listened the way he always listened, completely still, completely present. But for the first time I wasn't watching him from across a desk. I was sitting beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of him, and he was watching me back with those silver-gray eyes, and there was nothing careful about it. We didn't solve everything that night. I want to be honest about that, the way the good love stories are honest, not wrapping things in neat resolution, not pretending that one honest conversation dissolves every wall that took years to build. We sat in the rain-dark office and we chose each other, that much was true, but the choosing was a beginning, not a completion. There were hard conversations ahead, the professional reality of our situation, which we acknowledged carefully and directly, including the question of whether Eli should move to a different reporting structure, and the answer that eventually came: yes, to protect the integrity of the work and the relationship both. There were months of learning each other properly, not as boss and employee but as people, and discovering in that process both the things that aligned and the things that would require patience. Daniel was, as he'd warned me, not easy to be close to, not unkind, never that, but he was a man who'd built his interior life like a fortress, and fortresses don't open overnight. There were evenings when I'd reach for him and feel him pull back into himself, retreating somewhere quiet and closed where I couldn't follow. There were moments when he'd grow distant in the middle of a conversation. And I'd have to learn the difference between the distance that was about me and the distance that was simply his, a habit of mind that his whole life had reinforced. I learned to sit with it, not without difficulty, not without nights when I'd lie awake wondering if I'd been wrong, if I'd romanticized something that was simply a man too sealed up to be loved the way I needed. But then there would be a morning. A Sunday morning specifically, because Sunday mornings became our thing, the time we'd claimed as ours, when he'd bring coffee in bed without being asked and sit beside me reading. And at some point he'd set the book down and just look at me with that particular expression I'd come to know. The one that said, I chose this and I still choose this, and I know what it cost and I'm not sorry, asterisk. and I would feel it land in me like sunlight through a window that's been kept shut for too long. He called his father every week. I know because he told me, and later because I heard it from the kitchen, his voice quieter and more careful than his office voice, learning to say things he'd kept inside for years. That took time. That was its own whole story. I called my father every Wednesday still about football neither of us cared about. Only now sometimes I'd be sitting at Daniel's kitchen table when I called, and he'd be across the room making dinner with his sleeves rolled up and his reading glasses perched on his nose, and I'd catch his eye and he'd smile, that real rearranging smile, and I'd think, this is it. This is the thing I was trying to find the story for. Music full now, warm and full, a love that's been earned. 8 months after the night of the storm, Daniel and I took a weekend trip to Michigan, his idea, which surprised me. We drove up on a Friday evening, the kind of autumn drive that makes you feel like the world has been lit specifically for your benefit, all rust and gold and the particular blue of sky that only happens in October. We stayed at a small inn near the lake. Saturday morning, we drove through a town full of antique shops, his idea again, which surprised me further until I remembered the table. We spent 2 hours in those shops. He was more at ease than I'd ever seen him, out of the city, out of the office, in a plaid jacket with his hands in his pockets, unhurried, looking at old things with a thoughtfulness that had nothing professional about it. In the third shop he stopped. It was a dining table, oak round with a patina of age on it that spoke of decades, not a Harlow, some smaller maker long gone, but solid and true and clearly loved, clearly part of someone's life once. Daniel ran his hand along the edge of it. Someone ate Saturday breakfasts at this table, I said quietly. He looked at me. Yes, he said, someone did. We bought it, paid too much and didn't care. It barely fit in the car. We laughed the entire drive home, the table wedged in the back and our knees cramped in the front, and it was the most ordinary joy I'd ever experienced. That table is in his dining room now. Our dining room, eventually the word asterisk are arriving in our vocabulary quietly, without announcement, the way the best things do. On Sunday mornings, we eat breakfast at it. I want to talk about something before we reach the end of this story, something that I don't hear enough in the love stories people tell. Walls are not always cowardice. I've heard it said, I've felt it said sometimes, in the way people look at people like Daniel, people who guard themselves carefully, people who don't offer their interior life like a gift to everyone who wants it, that to be private is to be damaged, that to build walls is to be afraid, that the goal of love is to tear them down. I don't believe that. I've lived with Daniel for 2 years now and I've learned something else. Walls are sometimes how people survive things that would have broken them in the open. Walls are sometimes the architecture of a person who got hurt and chose, consciously, to protect what was left. The question isn't whether someone has walls. The question is whether they can find, in the presence of someone who sees them, the choice to open a door. Daniel never tore down his walls. He opened a door, one door on a November night in a rain-dark office, to one person who'd been standing there long enough to earn the invitation. And through that door, in the years since, he has carried more of himself into the light than I ever asked him to. More than he planned to, more, I think, than he believed was possible. That's not nothing, that is actually everything. And me, what about my walls? Because I had them too, I want to be honest about that. I talked about Daniel's and they're real, but mine were different, not the fortress kind, but the apologetic kind. The walls that say I'm here but not too much. I'm present but I'll make myself smaller if you need me to. I want things but I won't claim them too loudly. The walls built from the habit of editing yourself before you speak. From the years before I understood that the things I felt were worth feeling, that the love I was capable of wasn't a burden to be managed but a gift to be given. Daniel broke those walls too, not by charging at them but by looking at me with those silver gray eyes and saying, break the habit of redirecting credit. You're too good to keep apologizing for it. He said that about work, but we both know that's not all he meant. Music, something quiet and true. We're near the end now. There's a moment I go back to often. Not the kiss, not the night of the storm, as significant as it was, but a Tuesday evening about 4 months into whatever we were becoming, when we were sitting at his kitchen table, the new old oak one, working in companionable parallel silence the way we used to do in the office, but different now. He was reading, I was writing. There was music on low. There was dinner on the counter, cooling because we'd both gotten absorbed and forgotten to eat. He looked up from his book. I don't know why I hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but he looked up and he looked at me and he said, "I'm glad you said it that night." I looked up, yeah. I wouldn't have. He said it with the same plain honesty he'd used the night of the storm, no self-pity, no drama, just a fact. I would have let it become something I regretted for a long time, and I would have called it the right choice and filed it under professional asterisk, and I would have been, he paused, I would have been a lot less happy than I am right now. I didn't say anything, I just looked at him. "I'm working on it," he said, "the door being open, I don't always," his jaw shifted slightly, "I'm not always good at it." "I know," I said. "But I want to be better at it, with you." I reached across the table and took his hand. He turned it over and held mine. We sat like that for a long time, in the warm kitchen with the cool food and the low music. Two people who'd found each other on the wrong side of every reason not to, holding on in the simple, serious way of people who understand that love isn't the moment the walls come down. It's the daily choice to keep the door open. My name is Eli Carter. I'm 29 years old. I live in Chicago with a man who smiles more than he used to and calls his father every Sunday and makes excellent coffee from a machine in the corner of a kitchen we share. I work at a different firm now, not because anything went wrong, but because we both agreed it was the right thing, the honest thing. I run the brand narrative department there. I'm good at it. I find the soul in things. Daniel taught me how. He's still at Meridian, still the best in the industry, still the man with the gravitational field that makes people orbit at a careful distance. But on Sunday mornings, the door is open. On Tuesday evenings, over cooling food and low music, the door is open. On the nights when the city is loud and he retreats somewhere quiet and I sit near him without speaking, waiting, not pushing, just present on those nights, eventually, he looks up and the door is open. What I know now, that I didn't know 3 years ago in a navy blazer that was too tight across the shoulders. Love is not a feeling that arrives fully formed. It is a practice. It is the daily choice to show up honestly, to say the thing you're afraid to say, to stay in the room when staying is harder than leaving, to refuse the shortcut of pretending you don't need what you need. What I know now. The best stories, the real ones, the ones worth telling, are not discovered in the dramatic moments. They're in the Tuesday evenings, the Sunday mornings, the hand across a table in a warm kitchen, the smile that rearranges a face you love. What I know now. You should tell the person, the one you're being careful around. The one whose name you've trained yourself not to say too warmly, the one you've spent 2 years watching from 30 feet away because even that much proximity felt like a gift, tell them. Not because it will go the way you hope, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because you deserve to live in the open, because the weight of the unsaid is real and it is heavy and you were not built to carry it forever. Tell them, then step back and breathe and let whatever is true be true. The table in our dining room has a small scratch near the left leg from the drive home from Michigan. We left it, we didn't fix it. Because every mark on a well-loved table is a story. And we are only just beginning ours. That's the story of Eli and Daniel. A story about the courage it takes to say the true thing, about the difference between walls and wisdom and how love lives in the space between them. About the man who built a fortress and the man who stood outside it long enough that the door finally opened. If this story reached you, if you felt it somewhere real, I want you to know that you're not alone in the careful spaces you've built around yourself. You're not alone in loving someone from a safe distance, in editing your feelings into something smaller than they are, in waiting for permission to take up the space you deserve. You don't need permission. You just need one honest night and the courage to say the first word. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. New stories drop every week. And if you're carrying something heavy right now, leave a comment. Sometimes the best thing is knowing someone else is in the room. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.